Hello, everyone. I'm Suyash Rai from Carnegie, India. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this seminar on global supply chains amidst COVID-19. I hope you are safe wherever you are. This is being held under our knowledge transfer initiative at Carnegie, India. Uh, so, why are we talking about this issue now, and why is it important? So, while trade has been around for thousands of years, humans have always traded with neighboring villages, cities, towns, countries. We see varying trends depending on the changes in transaction costs of trade, technological capabilities in countries, the intellectual and political consensus around trade, and so on. Many reasons lead to changes in trade trends. And one major trend in the last few decades that we've seen is what you call international division of supply chains. So more and more supply chains have become much more divided across countries, where different countries play small parts in the supply chains. And this has happened across a wide variety of products and services, which were not possible, say, a few decades ago. And one of the consequences of this is that it has made it much easier for developing countries like India to participate in the global economy. So as long as a country, say like India, has comparative advantage in even one part of the supply chain, it can participate. And with some basic capabilities, you can start adding value to a part of the supply chain. And then as it acquires more advanced capabilities, it can produce more complex and high value products, goods and services. And it has created many opportunities for developing countries. And especially in Asia, we've seen a long story of countries growing by participating in growing global supply chains. The chief example, of course, being China. India has also benefited from this trend by integration of with global supply chains was an important part of our growth story during our boom years, which basically ended before the global financial crisis. Many good, well-paying jobs were created because of this trend, and we benefited a lot from this. But this story seems to have shifted a little in the last one decade. One fact is that in the last decade or so, especially after the global financial crisis, which also was accompanied by a trade shock, the growth in global supply chains has slowed down somewhat. It is no longer the boom years. Second is that increasingly use of digital technologies and automation is becoming an important source of comparative advantage for countries. And so in some ways, in some sectors, it is supplanting the labor arbitrage advantage that some countries have. And India could arguably be also one of those countries. Well, although it's not so clear right now whether this impact will be offset by other factors or not, and to what extent different economies will be affected by it. And finally, there's one more change. Of course, last few years we've seen a change in the political stance towards uh, internationalization of supply chains in some of the developed countries, US being the chief example. And if this trend persists, then it will be harder for countries like India to benefit from what I said earlier, international division of supply chains, which some of the other countries could benefit from. And even, I mean, closer home, Indian policymakers have also sent mixed signals about their attitude towards trade. And there has been some protectionist measures taken, and there has been obviously retaliation for them. So we are living in a very different world as far as the political and intellectual consensus on trade is concerned. And in amidst all this pandemic has come as a bolt from the blue for all of us. It has restricted the flow of goods and people, and it has kind of put pressure on supply chains because of this. There are also some talks, I mean, on the of some big shifts happening in global supply chains because of this crisis, and whether India could benefit from some of these shifts. And in this context, we are holding this seminar. And in this, we want to understand what was the state of global supply chains before this crisis started, what impact this particular crisis is having and is likely to have, and how, I mean, in somewhat speculative perhaps, but how this crisis might change global supply chains going forward in the medium term, so in the next year or 2 years. So to discuss these issues, we have two distinguished speakers today. Dr. Rajat Kathuria is the director and chief executive of the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, or ICRIER. He is a distinguished economist who has decades of expertise in this area. Ms. Soumya Krishnan is a senior principal at Kearney, India, and her expertise is primarily in pharmaceutical supply chains, but also in other areas, and she'll talk about her area of expertise. So the way we will do this discussion is I will now invite the speakers to make their remarks. After both the speakers have spoken, we will take questions for participants. And you can enter your questions on Zoom through the Q&A link that you can see below. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can send your questions there as well. Now, if I can invite Dr. Kathuria to please give his opening remarks.
Thank you, Suyash. And at the outset, let me thank Carnegie as well as Raghuveer for setting this up. So I'm going to speak about the questions that Suyash has asked, and I'll also sort of try and trace a little bit of history about globalization and comparative advantage. And at the end, I would conclude by saying what are some of the opportunities that India has in the context of what is happening today. But trade has always had a bumpy ride. I mean, there have been episodes where trade has been unfettered, and we saw in the hallmark at the zenith of globalization, there was unfettered movement of goods, and we had started talking about unfettered movement of services, although services have been a little more difficult to liberalize than goods, but there was a movement towards liberalization of services as well. Unfortunately, a couple of things have happened in the immediate past, in the last decade especially, that have dealt body blows to globalization, and countries like India have to deal with it. And I think India is at a point where it was going to benefit from globalization and internationalization of supply chains, and this comes at exactly at the wrong time, I beg your pardon, at the wrong time for India, because this was India's opportunity to benefit from global value chains and internationalization and fragmentation. And we could have, made moves to try and get some of those value chains to locate in India. I think we can still do, but we'll have to do a lot more work, a lot more hard work to try and price open global markets. So the way I'll sort of structure my opening remarks is take you through a little bit of comparative advantage, the genesis of comparative advantage and the genesis of intra-industry trade and economies of scale, and then the global value chains, and then to the current situation. As I said, globalization has had a long and bumpy ride. Immediately after the post-war years, we had setting up of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, where a lot of trade that used to happen between countries was of the kind which was between dissimilar countries. It was based on comparative advantage. If you had a comparative advantage in, say, labor-intensive products, and some other country had a comparative advantage in resource-intensive or capital-intensive products, then there would trade that would happen. And a lot of trade happened between dissimilar countries, and there were benefits to trade. Nobody traded because you were forced to trade. You traded because trade, essentially, I think, is a positive-sum game. Trade, unfortunately, or globalization, unfortunately, has become the victim of a number of problems that happen within a country, not because of trade, but because of other things. But trade then becomes an easy target for people, or globalization becomes an easy target. But initially, a lot of trade, as I was saying, was based on comparative advantage. If you had comparative advantage in whatever, it could be labor, you had comparative advantage in capital or technology, you would trade and everybody would be better off. But at the same time, there were a couple of things that were happening around the world. There was a lot of trade happening within Europe. There was a lot of trade happening between the United States and Canada within the developed countries, which could not really explain the kind of trade we saw as a result of comparative advantage, if you will. Economists began to try and explain, why do you have this kind of trade? And an explanation due to Paul Krugman, who was a Nobel Prize winner in economics, is as a result of what he called intra-industry trade, or trade based on economies of scale. So within Europe, you would have a lot of trade in automobiles and automobile parts. There would be a demand for variety, and you would get comparative advantage by specializing in a particular brand of car, or a particular brand of auto components, or a particular brand of a component that would then be traded across and finished in a particular country. As a result, countries would get advantage due to economies of scale, and you would also be able to then reduce your costs and be able to trade. So there was a lot of trade that was happening, what is called due to comparative advantage, and a lot of trade that was also beginning to happen due to economies of scale, which began to be called, as I said, trade within the same industry, within the same region, and it came to be called intra-industry trade. And this was, pretty much the kind of trade that happened up to the 90s. And then in the 90s, we had a big shock to the global trade system. And I think that was a shock, a positive shock that happened. And that shock was due to the reduction of transportation costs, a reduction of trade costs across the world. And these trade, as you reduce these trade costs due to globalization, and at that time, there were a lot of digital equipment that was laid under the sea. There were a lot of cable. Transportation became much easier. And there was another development as a result of reduction of these costs. There was another development that took place in the shipping industry, and that came to be called as containerization. So globalization as a result of reduction in transportation and trade costs, and on top of that, containerization, which provided you huge economies of scale to trade parts and components across countries, gave rise to a phenomena which we now know as global value chains. So you could locate production across countries, and inputs and components crossed borders many, many times before they are embedded in final products and were exported. And some of the beneficiaries of the global value chains or regional value chains were the countries of Southeast Asia that began to exploit the advantages of reduced transportation costs and reduced trade costs to become sort of export-oriented and export-led economies. And there are countries like Korea, countries like China, and then Taiwan, smaller economies, Singapore and Hong Kong, that have benefited as a result of the fragmentation of the value chains across several countries. And I think this was the sort of heyday of globalization and the heyday of the global value chains. And when these sort of benefits were beginning to be entrenched, there was sort of murmurs of trade sort of protectionism that had begun to happen, especially after China had entered the system. China had entered the WTO, and it became the factory of the world. It benefited a lot. And it benefited not only itself, but I guess it benefited a number of countries that traded with China. But a drag on the system had begun to be sort of initiated at that time, because a number of commentators, a number of economists, as well as policymakers felt that China had benefited from this trade system and benefited a little unfairly because it was not a market-based economy. It was not a transparent economy, and there were a number of subsidies given to state-owned enterprises that benefited from trade, and therefore trade that was based on unfair trade practices. So there was a little bit of contention, a little bit of anti-trade sort of initiatives that a number of countries had begun to talk about. But I think the trigger came at the time when we had the global financial crisis in 2008, and trade was a victim at that time, post 2008, because trade fell by almost 15%. But that decline in trade is very different from the decline in trade that we see now. Now we are seeing a decline in trade that is both sort of supply-led and demand-led, but the global financial crisis that happened in 2008, 9, and post that, that caused trade to decline because there was a demand shock, and people sort of deferred buying of luxury items, automobiles, and they deferred taking holidays. So there was a decline in trade at that time, but it was essentially demand-led, and there was a fiscal stimulus that was implemented by most countries, and trade recovered over a period of time. But the immediate decline in trade was about 13 to 15%. And the kind of decline in trade that we are talking about today could be to the extent of 30%. So this is a much more pervasive and a profound impact on international trade, because it encompasses, I think, both the supply side and the demand side. But just to go back to the first sort of blow to globalization is the financial crisis. And then there was a second impact to sort of the movement towards globalization or movement towards internationalization, which was the Sino-US trade war. And that happened a couple of years ago, and that also impacted trade. And the third blow to globalization or internationalization has happened as a result of this pandemic, which, as I said, has caused global value chains to sort of rethink in how they're going to how they're going to be located across countries. And I think what's going to happen post sort of 2020, post 2021, hopefully there will be some recovery. I think one of the profound changes that are likely to happen to global value chains is that people will think about building some sort of resilience, whether they're global or regional. They will try and build sort of some sort of resilience within the value chains. And the second thing that might happen is that you would also want to rethink the sort of model that has become extremely pervasive across countries, which is the model of just-in-time. And just-in-time, of course, allowed you to reduce cost. It allowed you to distribute production in the most efficient location. And I think both those aspects of global value chains are going to be rethought post-pandemic. And the reason they're going to be rethought is that people will think that just in time maybe is too big a price to pay, and you want to, in case there is some disruption in the value chain, so you want to build in some resilience or build in some insurance, and then you may want to also diversify away from a particular location in the value chain. Remember that because of China's participation in the global system, China had become the largest trading partner to over 100 countries. And countries that are located close to China had become sort of integral, their trade had become integral to China. And therefore, a lot of value chains began to be located in a regional basis, And I think there's going to be some rethink of that, some sort of diversification of value chains because of the reasons that I mentioned. And also there could be geopolitical reasons, and I'll be happy to answer questions on the geopolitics, but I want to restrict myself to the economic aspects of globalization at the moment, and I'm happy to talk about the geopolitics later. So the two things that I see that will emerge post-pandemic, one, as I said, is a greater diversification. And this is the point that we've been making in India ever since 2008-9, that some of the value chains could be sort of located in India. So this is, I think, to my mind, this is the third opportunity that India has to try and attract global industry, to try and attract some large manufacturers to locate in India, to locate the value chains in India. The first opportunity was when China was seeing higher wages. China became a very high per capita income, high by Indian standards. So they were, their per capita income was growing, their GDP was growing, and their wages were rising. And the first sort of instance of companies looking for alternative destinations other than China had happened at that time when wages in China had begun to rise. That was the first opportunity. And we had even begun to talk about attracting investments that was vacating China to locate in India. The second opportunity that happened was, as I mentioned, the Sino-US trade war. That was also an opportunity for value chains, for companies to locate their value chains in India. The pandemic presents India the third opportunity, and I'm hoping that we'll be third time lucky. The way to attract these investments in India is not through using the instruments of protectionism, but I think to use the instruments of trying to make India a more attractive destinations for investments to come into India. Protectionism would be exactly the wrong way to go because there's a lot of protectionism, there's a lot of uncertainty in the world that is happening. And these are exactly the two things that global companies don't like when they're choosing to move billions of dollars into a particular country. We know that protectionism is rising. We know that all the countries are becoming more inward looking. India has also said that we would want to become self-reliant. But I think India's self-reliance today is very different and very differently characterized from the self-reliance that we witnessed in India in the 80s. Remember, we had started on a model of import substituting industrialization. And I don't think that model was a big success because we were not able to attract foreign technology, we were not able to attract foreign investment. And we know that both of these have a lot of spillover effects in the domestic industry. Neither of this happened. We wanted to promote imports, and we wanted to substitute away from imports and promote exports. And we recognized that import substitution and export proportion were policies that were sort of confounding each other, that were in conflict one another. The moment we liberalized tariffs in 1991, we began to export a lot, meaning that our backward linkages grew. We imported, added value, and then exported, and our exports became competitive. So I think, our self-reliance today is very different. We want to make in India, but a way to make in India is not to increase barriers for investments to come in, not to increase barriers for components to come in, but to make it more attractive for those to be located in India. We've already done product market reform in 1991, and to a large extent, that product market reform has been a success. We also need to engage in factor market reform, in labor market reform, in land market reform, in capital market reform, all the factor markets that we know, so that it becomes more efficient for companies to locate in Iran. Remember, I've said that two things that countries and companies don't like is protectionism, and they don't like uncertainty. And for both these reasons, I think it would be India will be well advised to try and use the have policy certainty to liberalize in the right direction. I know it will take time, given India's political economy. It will take time to do that, but I think those are the preferred instruments. And I come back to a point that I made a little while ago, is that, when it is India's time to benefit from the global system, unfortunately, the global system is becoming a little more protectionist than it was. Remember, China, Korea, Japan before that, and a number of Southeast Asian countries took off on the back of export-led industrialization. And if we are hoping to get labor-intensive industries into India, the best way to find a market outside is if the rest of the world is becoming less protectionist. If the rest of the world is becoming more protectionist, it will be difficult for India to find those markets. And when, through the flying geese pattern, those of you who followed some trade literature, industries, etc., have a history of moving across countries. And as industries move, the ancillary industries also move, which has been the case in the past. But as Suyash was saying a little while ago, that process of industries and investments moving across countries, trying to locate the cheapest destination and the most efficient destination to produce, that has seen a little bit of a setback, because labor cost advantage now is being diluted because of the move towards robotization or substitution of labor by AI and artificial intelligence. And if that move gains momentum, then some of the industries that India could have attracted as a result of its labor costs and other advantages, those industries may not come into India, and that India would face a bigger challenge. But I hope one of the positive things, and I'm speculating here, one of the positive things that could come out of this pandemic, if there was anything positive about the pandemic, is that the search for profits and the search for the most efficient production technique could get a little bit of moderation, could be get a little bit of offset from the fact that the world today recognizes that the condition of labor and the condition of labor markets is really very, very bad and very poor. So instead of profit maximizing by substituting away from labor, you could try and generate profits, but also try and maximize employment. And this is true especially for labor abundant countries like India. So the move towards capital intensification or robotization or artificial intelligence, I think should receive a little bit of moderation from the fact that we need to promote labor intensive and we need to promote more employment. So companies, instead of searching for the highest profit as a result of substituting away from labor, they would be advised for social stability, for harmony, for inclusion reasons, for maximizing in their objective function, not profits, but generating high profits, but also maximizing employment. And as I said, this is something that could be positive, but it would require a behavioral change as a result of this crisis. But I hope some of that happens. And the last point I wish to make is that trade, international trade, goes through cycles. There was a time when trade, as I said, globalization was very sort of high on the agenda, and trade grew much faster than GDP growth. And we saw that for the world as a whole. When GDP falls, unfortunately, because of the tightly integrated global value chains, trade falls even more than GDP. So trade, as a result of this globalization, as people have called it, as a result of the decline in GDP, trade has sort of become the victim, and trade has slowed down a lot more than GDP has slowed down. And the reason I'm making this point is that protectionism and a slowdown in trade, given tightly integrated production practices across the world, is exactly the wrong way. To tackle this pandemic, countries, companies need to come together and become more open. Of course, there will be a political move and a political trigger towards protectionism, but I think this is exactly the opposite of what the world wants. Are there institutions that can promote the go back to, I wouldn't say unfettered movement of goods and services, but at least slow down on protectionism? Is there a body in the world, given that the WTO is not functioning as it ought to, is there a body can bring countries together that can coalesce and promote a freer trading system? And I think that body today is the G20. And I hope the G20, when it meets in November, when the leaders meet in November, one would discuss, of course, the pandemic would be discussed, but I hope that trade is also discussed, because the response that we need from global institutions today is less protectionism and not more protectionism. But if we see what is happening in health, and I know that Soumya is going to talk about pharmaceuticals, but if we see what's happening in the health industry, there's been sort of more sort of export bans that countries have imposed for domestic reasons. And I think that is exactly not what we should be doing. We should be moving towards more open economies, because to tackle the pandemic, it's a collective problem, and it needs a collective institution like the G20 to help address this problem. I'll stop here and come back and take questions later.
Thank you, Dr. Kathuria. That was really, comprehensive and very insightful. Let me take my privilege as a moderator and ask you a couple of questions. One point is the point that you made about this is being an opportunity for India, and this is the third time lucky, which is extremely rare, of course. But if you were to just take a step back and look at the last few years also, many companies are shifting out of China, and very few of them. So last year's Nomura study, you must have seen, out of the 56 countries that moved out of China, only 3 moved to India, 26 moved to Vietnam, and 11 moved to Taiwan, and so forth. So we've not been able to take advantage of these opportunities, which, because of the flying geese, have been around for a while. And if you look at the horseman's approach towards opportunities to grow based on current technological capabilities, India has been in a sweet spot for a few years now, because it has many more opportunities to produce products that are related to the products that it already produces and exports. So in that, we can get away with a light touch industrial policy approach to growth. So this is a puzzle for us, that why are we not able to grow more through trade? Why is our trade share constant at where it was around 2011? I mean, last 8 years, 9 years, we've not been able to grow our share in trade, and companies that move out of China are still not coming to India.
Right. So let me try and address the question at 2 levels. Thanks for the questions, Suresh. I think that's a question that a lot of people wish they could answer. Let me provide an answer at 2 levels. One is, and this is at a sort of a macro level, at a narrative, at a level of a narrative, let's say at the center or even at the states. Trade is now becoming sort of something that is being subjected to what is called enlightened mercantilism, if you will. And that is, exports are good and imports are bad. This is sort of, there was mercantilism in the past as well.
Yeah.
I'm hesitating to call that enlightened, because it was simply saying that imports are bad and exports are good. In enlightened mercantilism, some imports are good, we add value export, So we'll do some import substitution, but we won't do. So you're picking and choosing, and I don't think that's good for trade. But there's some sort of an enlightened mercantilism that exports are good and imports are not as good. And that sort of narrative has played out not only in India, but it's played out in several countries. And that manifests in itself in the following characterization, which is that if you're running a trade deficit, it's bad for you. And if you're running a trade surplus, it's good for you. And those of you who've studied trade, those of you who've even done economics 101, recognize that not all countries can run a trade deficit at the same time, and not all countries can run a trade surplus at the same time. In fact, it is the time when India ought to be running trade deficits in its sort of development paradigm, which is importing, capital, importing things that we're not good at, and then exporting them. But at the level of, at the national level, at the level of policy, there is this sort of strong narrative that exports are good and imports are bad, and deficits are bad and surpluses are good. And our experience in India has shown us, I just want to I don't want to dismiss this summarily, but I want to challenge this, because we've learned the hard way that if you want to become an export-led economy, or even if you want to export to the rest of the world, you need to import. You need to import efficiently and add value and then export, which is the whole basis of global value chains. And I'm happy to talk about, the diversification of global value chains, etc., and the value-added content in those, and how that has shifted in India and how that has shifted in China. And that has increased in India, and that is declining in China today as it becomes more mature. But for India, that value-added content needs to increase before it goes down. But as I said, that narrative is a strong narrative, and it appeals. It appeals to the common person, right? I mean, if you asked Paul Samuelson, what is something in economics that is both true and non-trivial, the answer that Paul Samuelson gave was the idea of comparative advantage, which is that I may be better than you at doing everything, but I'm still going to benefit by trading with you, because there are some things that I'm relatively much better at doing. And that's the idea of comparative advantage. I mean, we have to be able to rely on comparative advantage, import and export, to be able to, because trade, after all, is a positive sum game. But I think that narrative at one level is difficult to appreciate, because, as Paul Samuelson said, it's not easily sort of understood how the law of comparative advantage is working, but I think it works and it benefits us. So that's at the level of the narrative, Suyash. The second more sort of your here and now question is, why haven't companies come into India and located their value chains in India, when India is such a large market and the only one that compares in size to China, and also affords an opportunity for these companies to use India as an export destination? It's not that it hasn't happened. We have examples from Korean companies and Japanese companies that have been able to exploit that. But I don't think we've been able to do it in a sort of pervasive manner. It hasn't become sort of mainstream. It's been there. There are some companies that have benefited from it, but not all. And why is that not happening? Well, one way to answer this question is, if your own domestic investment is looking for opportunities outside because the costs of doing business within the country are high, then that sort of tells you something that is about how difficult it is to do business within the country. Companies, and we've spoken to from ICRI, a number of companies that we've spoken to, are now preferring to invest outside. One, of course, they're building their sort of supply chains, but two, also for the sake of ease of doing business, and they find that it's easier to do business outside, so they locate their production outside and then import it into India and use the Indian market for marketing. But, so I think it's the easy things that at some level, at the level of policy, but probably more difficult things in terms of implementation, that is challenging for us. And I referred to them in my opening remarks, and this is sort of certainty in policy. So although I must say that the secular trend of India is towards more openness. If I have come across as that India is a closed economy, I must say that that's exactly not what I'm saying. India is a very open economy. 35% of India's GDP is constituted by international trade. So don't get me wrong, the secular trend of India is towards more openness, but the more sort of here and now questions about taxation, about getting clearances, doing business, and getting the day-to-day things operationalized is still a challenge in a federal structure like India. A lot of the reform has to happen at the state level. And 10 years ago, a company from France told us that, look, it's very easy for me to take in men and machines and move into China. It takes me years to do the same in India. So why would I not prefer China over India? I think that was a decade ago. Things have improved, but I think incrementally, things need to improve a lot more because there's a lot of pushback in India as opposed to China. The pushback, both due to the presence of a strong domestic industry, where China didn't there is one narrative that China didn't have a strong domestic industry. So when foreign investment went into China, there was no pushback. And in India, there is a strong domestic industry. So there's some pushback, there's some sort of narrative that is built up, which is anti sort of FDI. But I think the more challenging thing is the simple things. One is the narrative at the macro level, which we are trying to sort of address. And the second is the more sort of day-to-day implementation challenges that India faces. And the Prime Minister has said that we wish to move India up on the ease of doing business. And as we move up the chain on ease of doing business, I think we will begin to attract much more investment, and it will become more sort of pervasive, it will become more diffused, and it will be more balanced in the economy. It won't be just the Haryanas and the Tamil Nadus that attract the investment. Hopefully, it would be other states that also become a destination for FDI that comes in from other countries.
Thank you, Dr. Kathuria. I now turn to Soumya. She's going to talk about perhaps the most important supply chain at this time during a pandemic, of course, the pharmaceutical supply chain. So Soumya, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Kathuria. That was really interesting for me as well, just to hear. What I will do is I will walk everyone through a very short presentation. It's more the practical here and now things that we're hearing from organizations. So not so much the theory, but more what are organizations doing. So I'm going to share my screen and let me know, Siyash, if you can see it and at what point you see it. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
All right, great. So 2 topics for discussion, and I'll try to keep it within the time limit. One is how global supply chains are getting impacted, and a bit of a deep dive on the pharmaceutical industry. So we partnered with the World Bank, and we sort of surveyed 400 senior operations and leaders across supply chain to just see how and what has been the economic impact on account of COVID on their supply chains, both from a demand side disruption, so consumer demand, pockets of demand, as well as from the supply side, the supply chains, networks, procurement, and supply bases. And unsurprisingly, there has been a large disruption. This isn't news to us. That disruption has been both on the demand side and the supply side. When we asked them sort of how well do you think your supply chain reacted to this disruption, while most organizations sort of veered towards the average, there were some that definitely felt that their organizations did much better. And what we found was really, again, unsurprisingly, industries like consumer, media, communications and technology and health, which continue to have a boost in demand, fared much better, while there are differences within this as well, versus something like automotive, which of course from the demand side saw a huge disruption. Again, unsurprisingly, if you look at this cut by company size, organizations that are much smaller or their supply chains fared more poorly than organizations that were large. A lot of large organizations have the scale, the bandwidth, the cash flow as well to be able to absorb disruptions like this. And we try to go a bit deeper into saying, okay, what is it that has contributed to this, and what is it that will change? What is the new normal going into tomorrow? So obviously, I really liked Dr. Kathuria's point on resilience, diversification, agility. organizations that have been able to weather this crisis, some, for example, Coca-Cola, 95% of their plants were operating 2 to 3 weeks into the pandemic because they have very localized bases. There isn't a lot of international flow that happens, both in their developed and emerging markets. Walmart as well, they have an agile operating model, so they were able to swiftly make changes to their entire chain, to be able to partner with complementary companies to kind of weather the storm. Unilever is another example of an organization that actually is reaping its rewards and returns on investments in digital and analytics, because there has been a significant boost in the ability of organizations that have invested in digital and analytics to weather this storm. Whether it has to do with, operating plans, their weekly planning, forecasting, to capturing consumer sentiments, doing this digitally and via analytics has really helped them. Looking ahead or going forward, what are organizations and what are supply chains going to be doing? Here is what we believe to be sort of 3 key changes. The first is diversification of supply bases. And what do I mean by diversification and dual sourcing here? Is that what's happened in the past is in the pursuit of cost competitiveness, somewhere along the way and in pursuit of profitability, the risk assessment or exposure of supply chains to limited basis has taken a back seat. If you look at it, organizations have also deprioritized risk management, crisis management, hedging roles in the last 10 years. You don't see these at the CXO, CEO -1 levels. And we do think that organizations are going to do a fundamental rethink of their supply bases. Multi-country sourcing across regions, continents, to make their chains less vulnerable, local for local. A second source, no exposures to a single source of supply, but multi-sources of supply. We see that happening. We do see organizations increasingly keeping what we call core processes or IP, component designs in-house, to be able to weather the storm and to be able to switch their contract manufacturing models as and when they need to. Reduced complexity. I think that while organizations look for alternate sources of supply and as they move to localization, they are going to reduce the amount of complexity, at least in the short term, of things being moved from one place to the other place. I think there'll be a lot more focus on organizations with regional strategies. So what is my strategy in region? There are, of course, limitations to this, but there will be a concerted effort towards understanding how much or how little that exposure to a global supply chain can happen. Core business priorities, we do see them getting in-sourced. Some companies have already started along this journey. And of course, a high degree of localization to the extent possible. Now, do we believe that all of these are going to provide long-term advantage? The jury's out there, but we do see organizations adapting and taking on these 3 sort of key directional shifts in how they deal with their supply chain. Some of the specific tactics that we've seen organizations already beginning to engage in or already beginning to invest in, and a bunch of clients. We see organizations, taking on specific strategies, varying from the ones that you see on the page, and I'll take a few moments to go through each of these. It's to weather, to be more resilient, and sort of set them up for the future. The first is acquisitions. A lot of large organizations are in the market right now to look at opportunistic plays, small suppliers that need cash, especially in digital and analytics, with the boom, with the fact that the new normal is going to have digital and analytics. Organizations, small startups, large organizations as well. We do see an M&A activity out there. Collaborative commodity risk management, and I alluded to this some time ago, is there has been a bit of a defocus on crisis and risk management We already see activity here. For example, leading CPG organizations are putting money into CPRM tools, smart cube tools. We see organizations going out to market, seeking consultant support on how to do risk management and also how to do crisis management. We do see collaboration, a lot of collaboration out there in the market. For instance, just in the first month of the pandemic in India, we saw a lot of CEOs and CXOs coming together on panel discussions and sort of brainstorming on how is it that they can partner. So one organization, for instance, that has a fleet of trucks offered to take goods and deliver products of another organization. Partnerships in the form of sourcing commodities. So glass bottles, there's been a sort of subdued demand in glass bottles globally, and organizations are coming together to pool their resources and try, increase the sourcing. Open book P&L discussions and resetting terms of engagement with suppliers. What does this mean? So organizations are moving away from traditional negotiation to, where you do an RFP and you engage in dialogue with suppliers, to actually saying, hey, this is transparently our cash and our position. Open your P&L, show us your P&L, and let's collaborate through this, especially with their strategic suppliers, sort of engaging in a true supplier relationship management. There is an increased focus towards tail management. What does this mean? When we look at the supply bases of most organizations, so supply bases, there is a huge tail of suppliers providing small services spread across the world. We do see organizations beginning to prioritize who are their large strategic suppliers, what should be done of the tail. And in that sense, there will be a lot of small to medium sort of size organizations that we see facing an increased stress in the short to medium term. The last one is advanced purchases of goods and services. For instance, media and communication, on television has seen a significant dip in the last few months. Media prices are available at an arbitrage. Organizations with cash are increasingly looking to that as a strategic lever to say where we have cash, try to win opportunistically to purchase up ahead of time. In the immediate term, yes, some of the immediate term actions, and these are pure short-term actions. There are emergency funds that are being set up for vendors, especially to protect vendors, supplier financing programs, building up of inventory. So especially in some commodities where prices are soft, there is an increased buildup of inventory. Also, this, to some extent, Dr. Kathuria spoke about this, moving from just in time to just in case. I think organizations are beginning to rethink their just-in-time supply chains and have a component of just in case for the future. Social responsibility credit. So what we see some suppliers or companies doing is kind of negotiating with their suppliers, especially on critical categories like APIs where prices have gone up, to say, hey, don't increase our prices, keep the prices the same, and we kind of give you, the right press coverage. We give you the right voice to be heard. We give you a platform to, talk about your brand value and the fact that you're socially responsible. Supplier network rethink. This is something that all of us are sort of aware of. The answer to this is not easy, especially for organizations which have great exposure. And joint investment with other companies to support suppliers. I spoke of this in the previous page in the form of partnerships and consortiums. So these are just some of the sort of tactics or actions that organizations are taking. I'll take only about another 5 or 7 minutes to talk through what's happening in the pharma space and what are some of the implications specifically as they pertain to India. So the pharmaceutical supply chains have sort of 3 key components. There are the key starting materials, KSMs and APIs, so the pharma ingredient, the finished dose, so the formulation, and then this is distributed. As we are amply sort of realizing, there is a huge dependence on number one, particularly APIs in China. Even if organizations globally start thinking of moving their base to India, this is not going to happen overnight. China has 10x the capacity and at significantly lower cost. That said, at least in the last 10 years, there has been a sort of increasing shift ever so slightly, especially in the generics space, as you see over here, where India is a key participant. So while India continues to depend on China for overall active pharmaceutical ingredients, in the generic space, this reliance is sort of getting a bit lower. We really do see India well positioned with all the right mechanisms in place, as Dr. Kathuria alluded to. With all those in place, we do see potential for our pharmaceutical industry, which has been quite battered in the last few years, to take off now. What we also see is that there has been a reduced sort of relaxation of global protocols, the clinical protocols, investigational activity, especially in the pharma chain. So a lot of drug trials have had some relaxations, and this is really sort of an area where India can step up. We can carve our position not only in the finished dose formulation space, but also in the API space. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. As I said, it is going to take quite some time. Dr. Kathuria alluded to this, but protectionism is one of the unfortunate outcomes, understandable but unfortunate. Protectionism, export restrictions we see that as a lose-lose situation in the future. As you see, 80 countries have imposed export bans or restrictions. India did this as well, but there was that back and forth that happened. There is a push for localized supply. Countries are really trying to completely rethink their supply base. This will have an impact on India, especially if we look to carve a position for ourselves in this space. There has been a surge in prices with the exposure to China. In the short term, even in the medium term, we don't see this completely getting eliminated, but it's a call for us to make our chains more resilient. How can we respond to the situation? And this is more organizationally. This is not in terms of governance or policy. Creating regional network of supply sources, incentivizing big pharma to move away from China. I'm working with a pharmaceutical organization now, which is seriously considering India as a tangible alternative, especially for their generics business. I think with the right forces in play, this could be a real value. Setting up manufacturing setup for APIs. The amount of space and the capacity that's in China, we don't have that now. But with that policy change, with that push forward, we think there can be a huge potential here. Embracing digital, I think India is well positioned in this space. I don't believe that an explosion of digital is contrary or will counter labor supply. There is this concept of bridgital, which is how can we use digital to actually upskill our employee base, upskill our labor force. India has this dual problem of an undersupply of overskilled resources and an oversupply of underskilled resources. And actually, digital at the forefront can only help us in the future. So these are just some sort of ideas that I wanted to share with the group in terms of tactics, moves that organizations are taking, and what we see as the future. Let me stop there and pause. I hope I haven't gone over time.
No, it was absolutely well timed. Thank you so much for the deep dive, and it was it's also especially interesting for me to see how companies are going to cope with this crisis, and this deep, quick study of 400 companies is very useful. So let me ask you a question about these strategies, tactics that firms have employed to deal with the crisis, and they are working to various extents. As you have shown in the first slide itself. So if you were to take a scenario where this crisis lasts, say, a year or so, okay, in terms of the public health crisis is with us for a year or so, how would these tactics, the efficacy of these tactics change in your kind of analysis? Because some of these seem to be like just trying to immediately manage, while obviously you can't make any fundamental changes. There's no opportunity to do that. But many of these tactics, will their efficacy be affected in the next few months, or will it continue? Will firms be able to cope with this crisis?
Yeah, sure. I'll try to give a short answer. No one's figured this out to perfection. I think it unravels. There are some tactics, especially as it pertains to collaboration, cooperation with organizations that we do see increasing if this crisis does go on for a while. I think some of the more immediate cash-oriented cash flow and protectionist measures will help weather the storm. But if we are in this crisis for the next year and a half, there will be carnage for sure, but there will also be an increased collaboration and a sense of partnership. Fewer players left on the table, but much more cross-pollinated, cross-collaborated outcomes.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll now direct some of the audience questions to you. The format is that the audience enter the questions in the text box and I read them out to you. So I'll read them on their behalf. One question that has come from Abhishek Bhatia, this is for Dr. Katuria, is that inequalities in GCCs are well known where farmers in developing nations have taken a hit. How then do you advocate for globalization if this argument holds true? So he wants to know whether this argument holds true, and if it does, then how do you advocate for globalization, and how can you make the prosperity of GBC more equally shared, especially in developing countries?
Hi, thanks for the question. So that's exactly what I was saying during my presentation, is that, for example, if you think of sort of globalization at a macro level, how did China benefit from, or how did Korea benefit? It benefited because, you know, trade happened, value chains located there, and they were able to serve not only the domestic market, but primarily they were able to serve the global market. And as trade happened, you know, GDP grew, wages grew. The cause of inequality and trade, I think this is one of the most researched sort of ideas in economics. And let me tell you that there is no conclusive proof. Now, for example, could I just say that, you know, the fact that US is importing, let's say, a labor-intensive product from China means that it is also importing the labor that is embedded in that product into the United States, if you see what I'm saying. Yeah. And what is happening as a result of that, now would trade cause the CEO pay in the United States to rise 300 times in the last, you know, decade or so? Is trade the reason why CEO pay is so high and the Wall Street protest? I mean, of course, I'm posing the question in a manner that I know how you will answer, but I'm sort of making, providing an extreme explanation to say, or at least a characterization to say, that trade may not be always the reason to blame for the inequality that exists within a country. Shomya made a very interesting point a little while ago, is that, you know, about the skills distribution in India, and we seem to have an undersupply of highly skilled personnel and an oversupply of underskilled people. And you know what trade does, really? What would trade do? If you go back to the trade theory, sorry, I'm keep going back. So if India were to export labor-intensive products which were intensive in unskilled labor, then what would trade will benefit unskilled labor much more than it would benefit skilled labor, because trade would benefit the sort of exporting industry. So I get the point. As the point is not incorrect that, you know, it could sort of lead to some amount of redistribution, but I don't think trade could be the only reason for the distribution, and we have to look elsewhere. Trade is a positive sum game. It benefits some people. There are winners and there are losers. And ideally, the theory says that if the winners could compensate the losers, and that's the sort of role of the government. But to use sort of protectionism to hope that income inequality would be reduced or to improve the distribution of income is exactly the wrong thing to do, because it is trade that would benefit the blue-collared workers in India that has benefited the blue-collared workers in China, in Korea, and Japan before us. And if you protect, it is the blue-collared workers in Africa in the future that will be affected much more. Because if trade doesn't move to Africa, I mean, if you continue the flying geese pattern after India, you would see that investments would move to Africa, and then African workers would benefit as a result of investment going into Africa. But if protectionism happens, then the distribution will turn adverse at the lower end of the skill ladder, and that would sort of enhance inequality rather than address it.
There's also another question which is, related to what you just answered, but I'll just kind of tag along because it will be quick to answer, I think. This is coming from Shashi Shaw. He's asking that in light of the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis, how trade can be beneficial for India, given that it's late mover in export promotion growth. Also, we lack the necessary infrastructure and institution framework for attracting multiple firms to make India a global hub of production. The question is, given the various developments, how India can benefit from being a partner in global value chain. So Prebisch-Singer is that relative price for primary commodities with respect to manufactured goods will keep falling, and he thinks that that's the reason why India will find it difficult to benefit from trade. So if you want to quickly just kind of...
I mean, there is some merit in those arguments, and Prebisch-Singer, that is the 60s and so on. And we did follow, import, as I said, import substitution and export promotion. It didn't happen. And, embedded in that sort of argument was the elasticity pessimism argument, if some of you would recall. And the elasticity pessimism argument was that, look, India is an exporter of primary products, and given the elasticity of demand for primary products is usually less than 1, India is not going to gain from international trade. Trade will be very unequal, and therefore let's do import substitution. And anyway, our exports are not going to grow even because of the elasticity pessimism. We've seen, look at the empirical evidence since Prebisch-Singer, since sort of Ragnar Nusk, and look at the empirical evidence post 1991. Has trade, and you yourself, Suyash, in your introductory remarks, talked about this, and has trade benefited India? I mean, I would sort of leave the answer for everybody to get for themselves. But if you just looked at the data, we've begun to export much more. We are one of the leading exporters of services in the world. Our import content of services has increased. Our backward linkages are increased. We've become a lot more open. And we are now exporting engineering products. We are exporting automobiles. We're exporting tractors. We're exporting products that the elasticity pessimists of the 70s would never have thought that India would have been able to export. And as Soumya said, we're the leading exporter of generics in the world. Would we have been able to do that had we remained a protected economy? And the answer is also for yourself to judge. But I agree that we have to nuance when we're playing a game like a prisoner's dilemma game. If the other country is becoming more protectionist, then sort of we will. I don't think unilateral liberalization is something that we will do now, even though some economists still continue to support the late T.N. Srinivasan, Professor Bhagwati in Colombia. They continue to support unilateral liberalization, even if the other countries were becoming protectionist. Unilateral liberalization would benefit. I don't think we'll go down that route of unilateral liberalization. We will try and get some benefit if we liberalize from the other countries. And I agree, it will be more nuanced. It will be oriented more towards domestic constituency, where we can exploit our advantage. If we are giving something, we would want to take something in return. If we are opening up our services market, if we are opening up our pharmaceutical market, if we are opening up our insurance market, we would want something in return, which is exactly what RCEP didn't do for us, and therefore we didn't sign it. I agree that sort of we will become more nuanced in our negotiations, but we can't say that our problems within the economy of inequality, of lack of employment growth, or the sort of decoupling of manufacturing and employment growth, we can't lay the entire blame at the doorstep of international trade. Maybe some of it, but not all that blame cannot be laid at the doorstep of international trade. Inequality has its sort of genesis in some of the things that Soumya talked about. The market has rewarded skilled individuals much more than it has rewarded unskilled, because labor-intensive manufacturing in India hasn't taken off the manner it did in China. Jobless growth happened because of various reasons, including that companies felt it was cheaper to substitute labor away, to get away from the inspections that used to happen, to get away from rent seeking, to get away from periodic reporting requirements. They felt that it's better to substitute away from labor and do more capital. Did you know that India's toy industry, India's leather industry, India's textile industry is more capital intensive vis-a-vis the same industries, the same firms in China at sort of not at an anecdotal level, but some evidence based on case studies shows that we didn't employ as much labor in these labor-intensive industries as other countries did. So I think trade, unfortunately, is visible. It sort of gets the blame for other weaknesses within the Indian economy. But we need to sort of look at our other issues as well. I mean, that's what I would.
So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if I were to summarize it, I'll say that if we put our own house in order, we don't need to be pessimists on trade.
Exactly.
I also think that, for instance, in the apparel and textile space, Bangladesh, for example, a key player, is undergoing significant stress. And so is our apparel and textile industry also undergoing stress. But we can play and can have a competitive advantage in specific industries where we're better positioned than some of our other South Asian peers. And this could position us well for trade going forward as well.
I have a question for you, Soumya. This has come on YouTube from Alok Kumar. He's asking, how can artificial intelligence be used in the field of global value chains? So it's a very broad question. If you take it the way you want to take it.
I mean, there are just so if I think of supply chain, let's forget value chain. There's plan, there's source, there's make, and there's deliver. And digital and analytics and artificial intelligence plays a role in each of these bits, in each component. And I think this answer would go into 15 minutes. But just to give you a very tiny example, maintenance of machinery and plant equipment in factories, which erstwhile was labor intensive in the sense that you'd check a microscope, you'd calibrate a microscope every few days, every few hours. Now, with artificial intelligence, for example, we move to predictive maintenance. You do this remotely, you do this through triggers. The amount of efficiency, the amount of time, and the amount of accuracy that you sort of unlock can not only help cost, it also helps, in quality of output. And I'm giving this to you as one of perhaps 200 examples where digital and AI can play a role across the chain. We recently sort of did an engagement with a pharma major to digitalize a large portion of their procurement value chain. And that itself, the notion is that this results in job losses, but I'm a strong advocate of digital to actually equip and upskill a large talent pool to bring them at par with the skilled and the highly skilled labor. And in that sense, artificial intelligence to me has a huge role to play. And organizations that don't embrace it will lose out most certainly in the next few years. They say that this pandemic has accelerated digital adoption by at least 5 years. And this is just someone saying it. It could be 10 years, but it certainly has accelerated that adoption.
So I want to direct this question to both of you. But first, Dr. Katuria, because you remarked on this earlier when you made your opening remarks, that we should firms should, instead of moving towards more capital intensification by using automation, robotification, all those technologies, you should look to develop more labor intensive production methods so that we can create more jobs and all that. But there's this is a question coming from Ritesh Kumar, that there's a global trend where firms are looking to generate profits in post-pandemic world times by using these technologies to improve their efficiency. So in that kind of a global trend, how would we be able to achieve this kind of an outcome? Because I mean, you're not an island. You have to, if all over the world production processes are moving towards more use of robots and automation and digital technologies, which basically at some level replace labor. How would we in India take a different path?
So at one level, I answered the question by saying that, we should invest. We haven't succeeded in some sense attracting industries that sort of are consistent with our comparative advantage, and that is labor-intensive industries. So our labor-intensive industries, we haven't been able to leverage that and capture them, and they're simply becoming more competitive in those industries and ensuring that we employ more people, especially women. And so not only do they employ more people, they employ more women. And this has been the story in China, in Korea, in Japan. And hopefully that will play out in India. It's not too late. The window of opportunity has not been lost completely. So this is at one level attracting labor-intensive industries into India and giving them scale. And that's the other thing that India hasn't been able to do, is giving these industries scale. And one of the reasons why we haven't got scale is because of some of the laws and because of the difficulty in acquiring land, and some of the laws. There's a lot of clustering around 100 employees or a little less than 100 employees in most firms. And then once firms become big, they sort of go much beyond that threshold of 100 or 300 or whatever that threshold is. And interestingly, if you compare with China, there are entire regions, there are entire regions that specialize in making buttons. That's all they do. They make cigarette lighters. That's all they do. That's what, Prof. Krugman was talking about when he spoke about the sort of advantages of economies of scale. And that price advantage was captured to a large extent by countries across the world, and also some of it by China. But that price advantage due to scale was captured by a number of other countries that were importing these products from China. So, the first sort of point A of my answer to that question is that we should attract labor-intensive industries, develop scale, develop firm dynamics such that they become large and are able to employ, and they will give rise to small and medium enterprises and the clusters that China saw. Hopefully those clusters will develop in India as well. The second part of my answer, as I said in my remarks, was speculative. And I agree with the tenor of the question, with sort of the way that question has been asked. Will that happen? In a sort of questioning way, and I hope it does. And my hope rests on the fact that every crisis is an opportunity for India. Definitely, we never waste a crisis, and we will do some reform. And the finance minister has announced some reforms, and hopefully we would follow through to implementation of those reforms that have been announced. But my statement was more at a sort of global level, given that this is a global problem, this is a global pandemic, and some of the sort of adverse impact of this pandemic is being felt in the labor market. That's the most sort of palpable manifestation of this problem across the world, is the labor market. There have been large-scale furloughs, as they're calling them. There have been large-scale unemployment across the world. In India, the numbers are staggering, but also across the world. Across the world, they would probably sustain for a little more because of their well-developed social security system. But if this pandemic endures, and there are reasons that it will, then I think the impact on the labor market would be adverse, and it would be profound, and it would be long-lasting. And therefore, my statement was much more in hope that the movement towards profit maximization, if you permit me to use a word which just to illustrate the problem, not to sort of identify with it, private sector greed, for example. And I'm using this with just to explain the issue, not to say that this is what the paradigm.
I think the connection is bad, perhaps we lost them. Soumya, do you want to come in on this question? It was directed to both of you.
Yeah, I mean, I really liked where Dr. Kathuria was going with it. Is that, look, if the future, if overall consumer demand significantly drops and we go into this recessionary phase, then it's definitely going to be a problem. I think then there's no taking away from that. I think that as a scenario, let's call it the worst case scenario, that certainly will be a problem. However, in the event that there is some sort of a recovery, there is some sort of a bounce back, and the staggering unemployment that we see now tapers off at some point, then I truly believe, I said this earlier as well, that digital and organizations embracing digital does not necessarily exacerbate that problem. There is, for example, in the field of healthcare, just diagnosis is something, and there was a book actually published by the Tata Group called Digital Nation, which talks about this, is in the field of education and in healthcare, how we can actually increase employment via the means or via the deployment of technology. So I think we've heard this rhetoric, and truthfully so, and it's rooted in fact that with the advent of digital, employment and what will people do is in question. But I think for India, given this dual problem that we have, it can actually benefit us, and it can actually help us uplift the sort of, that unemployed bucket. I don't know whether we've lost Dr. Kathuria in entirety.
Yeah, this is an infrastructure problem in India. I mean, we don't have reliable broadband sometimes. So I have a question for you from Abhishek Bhatia. It's about some shifts that are happening in prioritization of expenditure in sectors. So he's asking that with public health coming to the forefront in shifting health expenditure towards universal health care, how do pharma companies plan to come in on this front in the next, near future? And he's referring to, treatments of malaria, tuberculosis, HIV, and so on and so forth. So it's not directly related to
really good question.
But you can...
No, a really good question. I think for whatever it's worth, the greatest expense or the greatest investment that pharma organizations incur is in the field of R&D. So those that are in the space of drug discovery and clinical trial incur the maximum sort of outlay, and they are in a sense, the worst off in a scenario where universal health becomes a reality. However, a large chunk of the Indian pharma industry is in the field of branded generics. So there's little, not significant formulations and drug discovery. So in a future where there is increasing money being pumped towards universal health care and drug and drug prices sort of being stabilized, the Indian pharma industry, especially the branded generics manufacturers, are relatively sort of cushioned against that. It certainly will impact global pharma organizations. They worry about this and they postulate and strategize about this, every day. Some of that has to do with policy, and some of that has to do with how governments and pharma organizations would partner. But as it pertains to India, I think given the nature of what we provide, the exposure will be significantly less. So welcome back, Dr. Kathuria. We lost you for a second.
So now that you're back, let me
my internet connection died.
It happens with all of us. So let me direct a question to you, because you don't get to be back and not be asked a question. So this is a question that has come from Ria, and she's asking, what is your outlook for the impact that the pandemic will have on value chains in South Asia? So what is, some your view on how regional connection, of value chains will shift because of this pandemic?
Well, I mean, in one sense, I've already sort of addressed that question.
Yeah.
Let me sort of say, I mean, South Asia is the least amongst the sort of trading areas, the least connected with each other is South Asia, and for various political reasons and not for economic reasons. I think for economic reasons, we could be well connected. If you ceteris paribus, and there is a World Bank report that says this, ceteris paribus, India, when it trades with Pakistan, the amount of trade that it does, it might as well be trading with Brazil in a distant sense. So the kind of trade that India does with Pakistan is as if Pakistan were located in Brazil that far, because due to Paul Krugman, we have that gravity model of trade, which says that countries trade among each other based inverse of the distance and positively related to the GDP of the two countries. And if you use that sort of gravity modeling, you would say that South Asia is perhaps the least connected of trading blocks. If you were to gracious enough to call South Asia a trading bloc, it is perhaps the least connected of all the trading blocks in the world. Having said that, so what will happen to value chains for Bangladesh? Bangladesh, as Shomya was saying, in textile has become sort of part of the regional value chain, and that it's done really well in textile, but it hasn't been able to replicate its success in other industries. Perhaps Vietnam is a country that has been able to integrate much better with value chains in Southeast Asia. So while South Asia is not well connected, I think individual countries in South Asia like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and to an extent India are connected with regional value chains. And I wouldn't say global value chains, but they are connected with regional value chains. And one of the things that this pandemic is likely to do is that if there is search for efficiency, if there is search for sort of reducing costs when you are looking to diversify and making your supply chains more resilient, I think there is no country that is as attractive in South Asia and across the world, I think, as India is, both in terms of size. Because remember, these value chains are right now located in China. And if there's a country that offers the same sort of magnitude or order of magnitude of what China market affords them, is India. So I think there is an opportunity here. And as I said in my opening remarks, the opportunity has knocked on our doors for the third time. And I hope we grab it with both hands for the third time. But South Asia as a whole, unfortunately, ought to be connected more. But unfortunately, it is not connected as much as it should.
Thank you. So we have addressed most of the questions by now. At least there are some similar questions which I will not obviously ask. So before we end this seminar, I want to ask both of you one question: that share in global trade, and using gross numbers, of course, supply value chain numbers are different, is just over 2% last year. So if you were to take a decadal view, say 10 years from now, 2030, what is your kind of most realistic scenario of where India would be? I mean, assuming not optimistic, not pessimistic, just if you can answer that question, it will give us a sense of where you stand.
I'll let Dr. Kathuria answer first so that there's an anchoring bias, and I will formulate my answer around that.
Well, I mean, this is where fools were to tread in time of forecasting. But let me say this, that if I were to become a little technical, which is that the value content of trade and the gross trade itself, what's been happening over the years because of the proliferation of global value chains, and I'm talking about the time post-90s when global value chains or regional value chains proliferated. What happened is that these value chains spread across the world and across several countries, and the trade in value-added content, because remember, an input crisscrosses many borders before it is embedded in a final product. and that value added content sort of kept declining because as a value of gross trade, because if it crosses borders many times and you're measuring the denominator as gross trade, the amount of value that you're adding keeps shrinking across countries as a percentage of gross trade. So what's happening as a result of global value chains is that the total value added content has been reducing as a proportion of global trade. If we were to hopefully attract some of that value chain into India, then we would be able to, India will be able to increase the value. 2% is not the value added content of global trade.
Yeah, that's the gross. Like Reliance exports a lot of petroleum products, but the value add is very small.
The value added would be much lower. And I'm hoping that we are able to increase the value added content in total exports, the value added content in total trade over a period of a decade. And obviously, naturally, if it's 2% today and if you increase the value added, it'll probably go up. But I'm sort of unwilling to put a number, but all I would say that if value chains are attracted to India, and if we get some of our sort of domestic policy, as you rightly said, if we put our domestic house in order, if we are able to do that, then I think we'll be able to increase the value-added content in India, and thereby we'll be able to increase our share of international trade.
Very.
I couldn't have put it better.
Were you a diplomat in some part of your career?
I can't give a number.
Of course. But that was the kind of speculative part.
To be fair, it'll be more than 2%. It'll be more than 2% because we are, in a sense, as I was saying, the next big destination. Like China was in the 90s, hopefully we may not become the factory, but we will be a big destination.
And I think that was perfectly said. I think there are a lot of ifs and buts, and to a point that Dr. Kathuria made very early on, which is what is the geopolitical environment of tomorrow going to look like? All of this is relative. I think we're well positioned in the future. I think it's impossible to postulate what beyond there is the potential to increase could be.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you, for taking time out to join us for this seminar, especially this late in the day. Thank you to all the participants who patiently stayed on with us for almost 90 minutes. This video will be uploaded on YouTube shortly. It will pretty much soon after we'll end this discussion. Thank you. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you very much for organizing this. Bye-bye.